Welcome to Sydney, Australia. We're gazing at and absorbing the architecture of the Hyde Park Barracks Museum. This is the first of 6 episodes which documents and explores this amazing institution in Sydney. You will probably along the way recognize that my accent will change from saying the barracks to a North American pronunciation of the barracks, and sometimes I'll probably just change the whole thing and call it the Sydney Barracks. This is a fascinating institution and very accessible to those of you who want to engage in what we call penal tourism. This episode, like many videos in the series, is based on a recent book of mine called Escape to Prison, in which I investigate this phenomenon of penal tourism and this pull of punishment, this gravitation. What draws us into these institutions? The Sydney Barracks is the first of 2 institutions, maybe 3 institutions we're going to explore in Australia. And I want to mention a few conceptual items at the forefront. I mentioned absorption, which is how we as visitors visiting prison museums or art museums are drawn into and take in the immediate surroundings. We grasp the architecture, we internalize the architecture. Architecture matters because it sets the record straight. The Sydney Barracks was built by convicts. A brief summary of transportation from England and Ireland to Australia between 1788 and 1868. Between 1788 and 1868, more than 160,000 convicts from England and Ireland made the journey, which at the beginning of this campaign of transportation was about 9 months. They were able to get it down to 6 months and change over time. And when the convicts arrived in the bay, not far from this institution, there was nothing there but the Aboriginal people, who stared in delight, if you will, this amazing shipment of Europeans. They were really taken back by the sight of these large ships unloading these convicts. And this institution was built by Francis Greenway, who himself was a convict. This is a storytelling institution. And in museum studies, we talk about how storytelling institutions rely on techniques of performance. And Greenway is one of the many stories of this institution. This is the gatehouse. This is where the guards were positioned, because the convicts would enter and exit through this gateway here. And mind you that the Sydney Barracks was not necessarily a prison. It was secured accommodations. The prisoners ate 2 meals a day here and then ventured out into this undeveloped land to construct what is now known as Sydney, Australia. And once again, this is an institution this museum is very accessible. A lot of these historical sites in the city center are within walking distance of each other. I cannot recommend enough how informative this institution is. This is an example of how prison museums rely on space, objects, and images to convey a larger force of experience called the museum effect. We enter the institution and we notice that its interior is streamlined. These are polished wooden floors. We see ahead of us is a poster advertising Convict Sydney. Australia, from the standpoint as a penal colony, is a remarkable story. And the Sydney Barracks is a storytelling institution relying on performance that will expand our knowledge and appreciation of this example of confinement. The Sydney Barracks. The museum effect. Space, architecture, for example, interior, exterior, objects. We're going to see a lot of objects on display, as well as images and text. This is an important introduction. Sydney was a convict town. Again, 160,000 convicts from English and Irish cities made their way down under. 9 months down to 6 months and change. For working class people who come from English and Irish cities and towns, the Rocks, which is this section of Sydney. Let me orient you. This section here is the Rocks. This is the harbor. The famous Sydney Opera House is located at the tip of this peninsula here. So I just want to orient you to where the Sydney Barracks is located, which is right here across from Hyde Park. The Rocks felt like home for those English and Irish convicts. It had been built by the convicts and was their part of town. Their cottages and huts stood higgledy-piggledy along the rocky ridges and slopes. Many convicts and ex-convicts opened shops and pubs and businesses in the Rocks. Let me pause there for a moment, because these convicts who made their way across the ocean down under would serve a penal sentence that was handed down by the British courts in England and Ireland, and then they were emancipated. They were then allowed to live as ex-cons, as emancipated people. The sentences oftentimes were not terribly lengthy, 3, 4, maybe 5 years, maybe 7. And here we enter into an important element of Australian culture, which is a phrase known as a second go. Australian culture, from my experience having lived there, is a culture that is very willing to give people a second chance. In my view, much more so than the U.S. in my view, in my experience, which is, I think, a lot more punitive from its inception. And the second go can be traced to this period of the penal colony where these convicts were allowed to get through their sentence, building Sydney, and then being permitted to enter and join a community and build a society. A second go. Many convicts and ex-convicts opened shops and pubs and businesses on the rocks and brought up families there. Even after the prisoner barracks opened in 1819, married and well-behaved convicts continued to live in the rocks, and indulgence became increasingly necessary as the barracks filled to overflowing with the constant arrivals of ships. And yes, they kept coming. Convict men and women were also assigned privately as servants all over Sydney and lived with their masters and mistresses. Well, that's not to imply that they got something on the side. These are just proper terms. Those assigned to the government spent their days on the work sites dotted around the town, the dockyard, the lumber yard, the slaughterhouses, the lime kilns, the stone quarries. Brickfield Hill, now known as Surrey Hills in Sydney, a very lively entertainment district today, was an early manufacturing hub where convicts made bricks and tiles from the area's good quality clay. Let's pause to kind of absorb this introduction and return to this narrative after we've had a cup of coffee.